Hi, John Cipher here. My friend Jon Matzner and I recorded 3 videos that correspond to 3 parts of my book, Output Thinking. The first part is what is output thinking and how should you use it? The second part shows that the outputs are best produced by systems and that's how your company scales. And the third part is a holistic look at all the systems in your company and how they interact, and shows how you can organize things to get what you want from your company. There's a fourth part which we didn't cover, 20 exercises to do in your CEO time, and they're scattered throughout the book. I want to thank Jon for recording these with me and recommend that you follow him on Twitter and subscribe to his great newsletter on Beehive called Lazy Leverage to learn even more ways to improve your work as a business owner. With that, let's get to the video.
So, John, we're here today to talk about your new book, Output Thinking, and just kind of have a conversation about outputs, systems, buckets. Peter and I did one of these a couple weeks ago, and I thought it'd just be fun because I love your stuff so much, and the world needs more output thinking and systems thinking. So maybe a decent place to start that I think for most people listening in. So I read your book, I read an advanced copy. Other than citing some dubious people like myself and Peter Lohman, I thought it was extremely well written. But I'm just glad I got married. I got cited next to a drug reference, which checks out. About
All right, we'll leave that as a
Yeah.
mystery for the
We'll put that,
viewers.
find a book. But I thought a good place to start with this, which is a lot of the people who watch this are going to be like the business owners that you've worked with for like 30 years. I thought a good place to start would be like, what does a lack of output thinking look like or feel like?
So,
Where does it hurt?
So the biggest frustration that I have heard from clients and have had myself as a business owner is something to do with employees. And as you and I have talked many times, that's, that actually keeps a lot of people from scaling their companies, because then they have to grow it and hire more people and train and have managers, they just hate it. The frustration with employees, most of it, not entirely, but most of it stems to not being clear about what you expect, why you hire people in the first place. Well, why do you hire anybody? I don't want to get political here, but back, 10 years ago, people were talking about business owners are the job creators. No, we're not. We hate to create jobs.
That's a great line.
The job creators is the demand of mostly the middle class who wants to buy stuff. And in order to meet that demand, we have to hire people. So we hire people. And the biggest frustration is they don't do what we expect. And you hear that in your brain, you hear that in people saying, oh, I would have they would have known how to do this. I would have assumed that they did it. And the root cause of that is they didn't see the same definition of their job as you did. And their job is not to do work, it's to produce an output. So if you think about why did you hire them, you didn't hire them to sit there and do work. You didn't hire them because there's a desk with an org chart title on it that's missing. You hired them to produce an output. And at the most common level of interfacing with customers, that level is obvious. You're making widgets, you're making a sale. An output is a thing. But outputs are also decisions. Outputs are also solving problems. Outputs are also...
Oh, we're going to talk about the different types of outputs, John. I read your,
So it's that frustration of why aren't people doing what I expect? And often you didn't say it properly.
So I have 2 comments on that. One is a random esoteric reference, which I've been known to do. So I'll start with that. And then I'll go to the second one. One, it has to do with the nature of labor itself. And to your jobs program thing, I read this article once that said, you want a job creation program, outlaw construction machines. No more backhoes. I just created 1 billion jobs. Doesn't do anything. It's the outputs that create. It's how much dirt you move, not how many jobs. I outlaw all bulldozers. I created 1 billion jobs because bulldozers are now illegal. It's not about job creation. Stop. It's about the output of. So I thought that was interesting. It's a good
Yeah, no, that's true.
The other one too also has to do with Marx's theory of labor, which is he believes labor in his writing, and I'm going to butcher this, and I hope somebody takes issue with this who's like a political philosophy guy. But at a basic level, he believes labor is intrinsically valuable. But anybody who's ever had an employee goes, if John goes to work on a Corvette engine, I make it worse. It's worse. My labor has no value. My labor has negative value. And so this idea of labor as value in and of itself is actually rooted to Marx. When
Okay.
it's tied to Marx's theory of labor.
So I'm not a Marxist theory kind of person, but I will say that there are the flip side of that, not to the business owner, but people do get an identity and a satisfaction from a job well done.
Yes.
There's a great book called about shopcraft, about that we have missed, by taking things out of the physical. There's a whole excitement of just being able to do stuff with your hands that we missed.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as having it be valuable in business.
Yeah. In and of itself.
Yeah.
In and of itself. Yeah. Now, the other thing I was going to ask, since we're talking about kind of like the initial pain of somebody's reading this or watching this right now, and they're like, in this pain, is it fair to say that it manifests in employees, but in reality, employees are kind of like second order in that the solution doesn't lie with more employees. The system, your book is about just taking it, stripping away the kind of symptom and getting into one level deeper, which is in fact output-based thinking, systemization, is it fair that like what you're saying is like, I know it feels like it's at this level, but it's actually about 10 feet behind this level. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think the 10 feet behind level is getting very clear as an owner why you're hiring somebody, what that output you expect is. And there's a lot of unspoken things that you expect. You expect timeliness, you expect certain quality. And if you don't specify those, then it's hard for somebody to do what you want. And particularly as the world moves toward more and more knowledge work, this becomes way more important. Because if I said, look, your job is to paint this room, we could agree pretty easily when you're halfway done.
Yeah.
But if I say your job is to do some research on my competitor,
Yeah.
I have in my mind what research on the competitor looks like.
Yeah.
And I didn't tell you. Do I mean a 10-minute Google search? Do I mean hire McKinsey to do $100,000 secret shopper thing?
Yeah.
But I have that in my mind, but I didn't specify it. That's the output that I'm looking for.
Now I know you and I occasionally will take some punches at Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS. Yes. Would you agree or disagree with the system that a good output has a number? You can find a way to get in, even if it's maintain relations with vendors, which is kind of like a wishy-washy white collar output. Can you find a way to make that a number?
I think there's a problem. There can be a problem with that.
Yeah.
Because then you get to something like the NPS score.
Yeah.
And, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend? And I read somebody was saying, Microsoft asked me that about their operating system. The answer is 0. I never talk about operating systems with my friends. It has nothing to do with whether I like it or not. And
irrelevant.
So if you do it improperly, what it can always be is turned into something that's visible.
Got it.
A relationship with a vendor. Well, how do you define a good relationship? They return your calls, you return their calls. They give you a good price, you enjoy the process. Those are all very visible outputs that don't always relate to a number. And particularly with smaller companies, and I mean like under 100 million, if you try to put everything into a survey and a number, you may get the wrong impression.
So I as much as I want to go off, in different directions here, we're going to kind of structure this into 3 different, this first talk we're going to do is about outputs. Second one, we're going to talk about systems, and then we're going to talk about buckets. So I've stayed confined to outputs. Do you think now is an appropriate time? Because one of my favorite things I read in your book, I don't remember if it was in the output section or not, so we might end up punting this, was this idea of phantom outputs. Or
Yes.
is that in the output section? I
Yes,
forget.
it is. So the flip side of that.
That was actually, like you and I've talked a million times. So most of the stuff in your book, I'm like, yep. And then we've never talked about phantom outputs, which I think is it's the cause of a lot of like things breaking when you scale, is because there's a finger on the scale of the output methodology that you haven't factored in. So I want you to talk a little bit about phantom outputs, because I was like, oh, that's a really cool idea.
Yeah, so this actually bridges the gap between outputs and gets into the systems. But a phantom output, I call them shadow outputs in the book. Same difference.
Oh yeah, that's head injury.
Is it when you have a really good person? So let's say you have a really good employee, and what do you mean by a good employee? Often you mean they just figure out what to do. I don't have to tell them; they just know what to do. They quote think like an owner, which is really scary because if all your people thought like owners, they'd all be your competitors. And there'd be nobody.
Yeah, don't walk down that path too far.
There'd be nobody to work for us. But so they take on all this stuff. But it's like grandma in the kitchen's really good cook because she just knows what to add. Well, great, but you can't build a recipe on grandma without. I mean, a restaurant on grandma without a recipe.
Yeah.
Somebody has to know how to do it repeatedly. And if somebody is just figuring stuff out, the danger is you can't promote them, because they'll stop doing some of those things that you didn't even know they were doing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's bad for their career because they do things that you didn't think you hired them for, but they need to be done. One example is somebody who's, let's say, your bookkeeper, but is really good at catching typos and a good proofreader. Well, now you need somebody to proofread your website and your brochures and your social media stuff. And if that's not part of their job and they're just doing it, you go, oh, isn't that great? They do that. Well, great. Okay. Now, when you promote them, what's going to happen to that proofreading piece?
Typos in your POs or whatever.
Yeah. Right? That phantom, that shadow output that they actually are producing.
Yeah.
And
that's such a cool, I love it. To me, it's the, oftentimes it's the sticking point, and it's so hard for me not to pull into our systemization.
Yeah.
Chapter. I'm like biting at the bit to be like, so I'm not going to jump in there as much as I want to, but because we're talking about outputs, but I think basically unaccounted for outputs is oftentimes a huge landmine as people walk down the path that you and I advocate. Is my bookkeeper just does the book, so I'm going to get a bookkeeper. That's their output. And you're like, dude, Beth, hosts the lunch at the warehouse every Friday that keeps the crew involved in the company so they don't freaking quit, because she's so nice and she orders pizza every Friday. And you think she's just a bookkeeper. Dude, she's the mascot in your company, or he's right. Like that's a perfect example of like, why is my crew
that extra stuff?
Like,
and then you go, well, we'll hire this other company, which is great. They may do actually better bookkeeping, and they may have more resources to throw at it. But what about that other thing? What happened to that?
Yeah. It's a great, it's a really good way to think about it. Now, if I think about like where people would disagree with this, like where I was trying to poke at it, I have one like big poke and then a smaller poke, right? Which is, do you think that how would you address somebody? And I'm not asking this question. I'm putting my other person hat on. How would you feel about somebody who says, I'm a human being. You can't reduce my job to outputs, Jon. I am a fully blossomed, fully realized account executive. How dare you, you fucking bean counter, come in here and say I have outputs? Like a soft pushback on it.
So a lot of those outputs that you can't specify are critical.
Yeah.
And we can't necessarily tell you exactly how to do all of them, but we need them to be done.
Yeah.
And if you are that person and you can come up with amazing things, I would rather have you doing that all day and get rid of the other stuff.
Oh, we're going to talk about that. Oh yeah. We're going to talk about that for sure.
So,
which is output thinking, I think, to say it another way, lets you be more of an artist, right? It lets you, it lets Picasso paint instead of order paints. There's no artistry in ordering paints. There's artists. So my output is Picasso's, but why are you ordering paints?
Exactly. And on the other hand, there is somebody whose artistry is figuring out the best paint supplier.
Yeah.
And they're thrilled to do that. And they know they can't paint like Picasso. So let them do what they're really good at, and let Picasso do what Picasso's good at. And it's the concept of everybody plays at the top of their game.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that a lot, because that was, you know me, that's like a big thing for me. Is now, I think the other thing too that I'm still getting my head around, that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, is the idea, we were talking this morning randomly. I'm a big getting things done guy, David Allen, and he talks about people look at their to-do list and it's all wishy-washy. And so the way that he forces them to clarify is, he says, what's the next physical thing that is involved with you pushing that ball forward? So it's like, he says, like, podcast with Jon. It's like, what's the next thing that somebody could observe? Oh, send email to podcast production agency. And it squeezes this big nebulous cloud into a physical action. And I think similarly with outputs, you've done more thinking than I have in terms of like types of outputs. It's not just like a document or I think you have different types of outputs, like what makes a good output? How would you coach people to think about outputs? Because like
an output is
good thinking on
an output is something visible, or something that if you were hiring a contractor instead of an employee, you would write it as scope of work. That's the definition of an output.
Is maintaining a good relationship a good output?
Yes. And starting relationships.
Is that physical?
It's visible. It's not physical, but it's visible. A change in status is an output. So an inspector, for example, is inspecting parts. Well, before they come to that person, you don't know if they're acceptable or rejected. That inspector changes that status of that part to accepted or rejected.
Interesting.
That's visible. And and so that's the output. A janitor doesn't make a room, but they clean it.
Yeah.
It's clean. So that's visible. That's how relationships are, same way. So business development people, their job is to start relationships that will ultimately end up in sales or joint ventures or something else down the road. It's very important for searchers when they're buying a company. Often the seller has lots of relationships with customers, with key vendors, even with sources of employees, et cetera. And when that seller leaves, if those relationships haven't been grafted onto somebody in the company, those relationships might go away.
And connecting it to the previous topic, oftentimes when a founder leaves and it's the first owner transition, huge shadow outputs.
Yeah.
Huge. Like that's like, oh man, he does. And it's not part of his job title or his description. Oh, I do the sales. And then you find out that right underneath the hood, he's also the one who does the purchasing, or all these weird shadow outputs that are not neatly aligned, right? Like connecting those two topics.
And almost anything that's in your head, if you can explain it, you can delegate it. You can put it into some kind of recipe, but it's not, I think entrepreneurs have a reputation as control freaks that's unwarranted. I think a lot of times that's because entrepreneurs are very intuitive and not procedural. So they kind of know when something's going off the rails and they grab it back and go, wait a minute, we got to fix this. And it looks like control freaks, but if you put it into a system, if you define the outputs all along that chain, now we can check on those outputs earlier on in the process and fix them. And it doesn't have to be me doing it. I can show somebody else to do it. I had a client of mine was running a restaurant, and like many restaurants, he was not the most profitable. So he had used equipment.
That's the euphemism of the year.
Yeah.
Well, he struggled with restaurants.
Yeah. And he had a lot of used equipment. So he had those deli cases with the glass front, and it's a refrigerator case. And he said every time he walked by, he would stick his hand in because he knew they were going to break. and he wanted to catch it before all the food went bad. And he was frustrated that none of
Wow.
his people figured out to do that. And I'm like, well, they need to be told. First of all, they need to be told to do that.
Yeah.
Secondly, you probably should just put a thermometer in there and have somebody's job to check it 3 or 4 times a day,
Yeah.
and, whatever. And now, of course, you can get the units that'll text you when they're
Yeah.
going bad and whatever.
Yeah.
But, that kind of thinking, he knew intuitively he had to do that,
Yeah.
but he didn't take that next step and translate it into something that somebody else could be held accountable to do.
It's so hard to, without again jumping into the system stuff, which is the second part of our conversation. But talking about outputs, right? I had this was a couple years ago, and I remember seeing it, and I was like fascinated. I was at Whole Foods, and I was seeing someone clean the floor, and every time they'd clean a section, I saw them put a fob up to a little thing at the end of the aisle.
Hmm.
And I was like, what are and I watched them and I was like, what are they doing? And I realized what they were doing was collecting data on clean duration, when something could be cleaned, because they were trying to build an output-based system and they needed data, they needed ways to check it instead of the GM kind of eyeballing it and going, aisles clean, don't need to send them. They were building cadences. I imagine they were doing all sorts of really cool stuff to
Yeah.
basically go from hand in the fridge to a sensor or those kind of, I was like, and I was like, what are they doing? And I was like, they're tracking how much they clean.
Yeah.
It was a
And
really cool manifestation of output thinking.
tracking slows you down
Yeah.
because now they gotta stop, and they can't just clean the floor. They have to put the fob up and they have to do this, but ultimately it speeds up the whole system.
Yeah. And I think we're going to get into this in the systemization stuff, which is, of course, my love
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
But it's like, um, I think that I think that the promise of output based thinking, I think it lets people, people talk to me or people talk to you and they start thinking about their company differently. I get that feedback all the time. I never like I've never thought about my company like that. Like what outputs I create as the leader of the company. I I don't even know what
Yeah.
question you're asking. I just am trying to make $2 from $1. Like, they've never thought about it as a separate organism, and I'm asking them to describe the hand and what's the hand do, and they're like, "What?" I show up, I answer emails, I try to work less, but I often don't. Like, it's this very for especially for the smaller range of what who you and I work with. I don't think they've ever thought about their business as a collection of outputs. They've thought about it as either a collection of people or they've never really thought about it on like the meta level. Like often, like they've never thought about the business of running a karate studio. They've only thought about like, I gotta fucking open at 7 a.m. Like I imagine
And
you have a lot of
the
experience with that.
the things that they do look at are typically revenue and profit,
Yeah.
and often not even profit,
I
mostly
was gonna
just revenue.
say, they look at how much cash in the bank account the
Yeah.
month.
But there's all kinds of, uh, outputs of other systems that go into that. So I was talking with a client the other day. They have, several retail stores, and they said, "Well, this one store is not the energy was not there." I said, "Okay, how is that reflected in the numbers?" "Well,
Yeah.
the sales are down." "Okay, what part of the sales? Are we looking at not enough people coming into the store or the transaction value being lower?"
It's smaller, those
Yeah, and those are 2 very different outputs from different sources. So,
Mm.
people coming into the store is the output of marketing and advertising, and what they buy when they're there is the output of the salespeople.
Or merchandising or
Yeah, all that.
cues or yeah.
And so we looked at it, and actually their transactions were up,
Mm,
but the size of the transaction was down.
mm,
And so now we knew where to target because we looked at that. I wanna go back to the shadow output thing for a minute, because one of the things that we see when those outputs are not clearly defined is people do other people's jobs so that the end result happens.
mm,
And the example I give in the book is there's a very clear division of labor between myself and my mail carrier. My job is to address the envelope, put the stamp on it. His job is to drive it somewhere or put it in his system that gets driven somewhere. He won't do my job. If I just say, well, take this, it's the same place my grandmother lives, with, whatever, he won't do it. And you see that in companies where people will cover for other people because they want the ultimate customer to be served well, which is a noble desire. But, and once in a while, I'm not saying be a jerk about it.
Yeah.
When somebody makes a mistake or when somebody's too busy, yeah, jump in, help. But if you do that all the time, first of all, you may not be as good at that job as they are. And secondly, it may be hiding that shadow output that you're doing, may be hiding the fact that they need more training or they need better tools, or maybe they're in the wrong job.
Resources or
Yeah, exactly. And so ultimately that helpfulness can hurt the organization. I mean, you think about a football team or any sports team, everybody's got certain roles.
Yeah.
And the left guard doesn't just jump in and say, "Oh, I'm going to be the center today."
Yeah. Yeah, the quarterback. Yeah.
It's very different. So
Now, I want to, we'll end on kind of like the promise of output-based thinking, which I think is important that we should always kind of end our conversations with. But I wanted to just kind of like sniff around one objection to this. And I don't know if it's any good, but it was just as I was reading this section of your book, I was just like, so yeah, did you read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke?
Yes.
So I was realizing that there's some kind of parallels on output thinking to some moral philosophy about like essentially like consequentialism, meaning judge the road by where you go, not basically like if it saves kids from starving in Africa, moral good, and utilitarianism is a part of that and all this stuff, right? But to some degree in a business, outputs can be out of your control, meaning so there might not be anything to this idea, but I just wanted to like play around with it a little bit, which is like, don't I want my team to focus on controllables, like a good relationship with Bob, the big account, even though that's an output, is that really under the control of the account manager, or is defining the output in a way that is more within his locus of control, more coachable, more trainable, more, because they can't, if Bob's an asshole.
Yeah. So the answer to both of those is yes. And I was actually saying this to Nolan Gore the other day, who on Twitter posted his chart of things that he's holding people accountable to and everything. And I said, some of the things on that list are completely under your people's control, and some of them are the results. And do you handle them differently? Because let's take sales as one of the easiest examples. I can control how many marketing pieces I send out,
outbound emails,
how many calls I make,
right,
and sometimes even how many meetings I have.
Yeah.
I can't control people's response. But if all I'm doing is measuring my things I can control, that may not bring in any sales at all.
Correct. See, this is what I'm like. So do you make the output volume of sales closed or number of emails?
Well, but between those, in certain cases, those two things are identical. If I'm making widgets, I can control how many widgets I make. Yeah. Widgets go out. That's a good thing. With sales, where it depends on somebody else's response, there's a hypothesis in between those two things. The hypothesis is, if I send this many, let's say, Facebook messages, well, the hypothesis is my customers are on Facebook. And the hypothesis is they will respond to this message. And if that hypothesis is wrong, I can do all the work. I can send all the messages I want, but I won't get the response because we haven't done the A/B testing to figure out what that connection is. So where it depends on something that's out of your control, you have to look at the hypothesis.
So let me to be specific, because I want to hear how you would approach this very live example, because I've disagreed, like me and Josh Schultz, not disagreed, but like, I don't know the answer to this. Okay. I'm running a field sales force and they run sales appointments, right? Very obviously their activity-based metrics are within their control. And theoretically, their volume of sales is also in their control, but it's kind of a lagging indicator. Like, so do you manage them? Do you manage their outputs on the activity metrics? Or do you say, just win, baby? Some Al Davis, Oakland Raiders. Like, I don't care how many freaking LinkedIn messages you send. You sell 50 grand a week. I love you long time. I don't care how hard you try. So if you, in that specific instance, when you have your sales meeting, do you just say, I don't give a shit about anything other than how many dollars you brought in? Or do you say, like, how do you think about that from a managing output standpoint?
I think about what's the connection between the things they can control and the things that they get the results from. And how can we replicate that? As it turned out, this one guy has a better list, or is he better at cultivating those relationships? And then you get to another piece of the output, which is where when you understand the granularity of outputs properly, you can manage people better. This maybe goes back to your thing about I'm not a machine and all that.
Yeah.
Because you can tailor their specific outputs requirements to what they're really good at.
Yeah.
So with the salespeople, you may find some people are just better at starting new relationships with new customers, and others are better at upselling existing customers.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you figure that out, now you can say, hey, we're gonna split the sales into these two categories, and each person is going to figure out or going to be working on what they're really good at. But you can't just say, okay, give me numbers.
Yeah.
That's a way to burn out salespeople really fast.
And it's a way, it's a bit of it's reductionist, meaning as a sales rep, I might be really good at landing big accounts through networking, but the guy next to me might be the cold outreach guy who closes lower ticket. There's a lot of paths to enlightenment. And so by saying like number of cold outbounds, you got to get your 100 in. I think it's a bit of a right? So I know you're not that unsophisticated.
And that's where the manager's job is to understand their people, their skills, the specific details of those outputs, and really get the hypothesis correct of what works in this market. And sales is one of the things where it's most dependent on people's response, although hiring is probably a close second because hiring is actually a sales job.
Yeah. It's interesting. I struggle. The reason I ask is because I that management line about, well, do I hold them accountable to outbounds or do I just like, it's not, I don't think that there's an easy answer. It's oftentimes based on the rep and the product and the sales cycle and the lead gen methodology. It's not as easy as just being like,
well, the company that I moved 1,500 miles away from and ran for many, many years, the hardest part to figure out was marketing. We were selling to the apartment industry, and it took a long time to figure out what was the key driver to getting more and more accounts. And before I could ask people to step in and do the work, I had to figure out what the work was.
Yeah.
And
it's oftentimes my dad, very smart entrepreneur, I think who you've met or we've talked about before. But he's like, the reason why you do all the jobs in your company, even though it's only for a few days, is because you figure it out and then you can hold people accountable.
Yeah.
That's why you earn your way up the company because okay, is this reasonable to do this? Is this actually how you generate business? It's, so
in that business, we were selling to apartments. We had to figure out where in the food chain we should sell to. And the two things we came up with, we tried emails, we tried banner advertisements back when those were a thing. We tried trade shows. The two things that worked, one of them was postcards, which was completely under our control because we could buy lists of where apartments were. And the other one was when somebody left a job in one company and moved to another company in the same industry, they took us with them. We couldn't do anything about that.
Well, with control.
It was like, okay.
Yeah. It's like SEO. It's like,
and we tried like, oh, we'll give you a bonus if you take, none of that ever worked. But that was my job, is to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and then hold my people accountable to doing the things they could control.
So in closing out our output section, I can hear, an entrepreneur on the other side of the camera, like dozing off in their seat as you and I go down the output thinking,
Right.
Which, can you talk just briefly about the promise of output thinking, which is like sell the sizzle, like I in 1990 or whatever year that was, from a freaking beeper, I was growing a company that I was,
So
like the
here's the
sizzle of
promise.
output thinking, you know.
The alternative to output thinking is what I call org chart thinking, looking at your company as a group of people with these hierarchies and reportings and job titles. The outputs are actually more permanent than your people.
Mm.
Because as people move up, move in, move out, those outputs have to be done.
Mm.
And if you don't understand what they are and how to train people and how to empower people to do them well, then you're going to be dependent on people and on the availability of good people. And this brings up, we'll segue into
Part
the
two, you're putting the teaser in. So tee up section.
so
Tee
tee up
our
the
second
systems,
installment.
which is a quote. I think it's next to your quote in the book, which is quote from Daniel Jones, the chairman of the Lean Enterprise Academy, which turned into lean manufacturing and stuff. He says, brilliant process management is our strategy. We get brilliant results from average people managing brilliant processes. And we observe that our competitors often get average or worse results from brilliant people managing broken processes. And it's much easier if you're scaling a company to find average people and plug them into brilliant systems than to find brilliant people everywhere.
Nope, nobody knows this, John. I have that quote tattooed on my back. It's just, it's in cursive, and I look at it I wake up in the morning and look at it in the mirror.
There
Well,
you go.
that's a good end to kind of installment one, which is output-based thinking. And we'll pick it back up with part two, which is systems. So